Hi, it's Dwyer. It's October 11th, 2022. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, this is one of those rare moments in boxing that we can talk about something that we don't normally talk about. The culture, in my opinion, right, I'll use the C word, the culture of performance-enhancing drug usage that's taking place in the sport, right? The reason we can talk about it is Conor Benn failed a VADA test, right? Something came back in Conor Benn's test that hinted at the use of substances that promote female fertility. Now, as I pointed out in an earlier video, you've had people like Manny Ramirez, look him up, baseball player, great hitter, Hall of Fame numbers, get suspended because he had female fertility drugs show up in his test results. In other words, female fertility drugs are associated with performance-enhancing drug usage. So, you've had some great reporting. You've had Chris Algieri give interviews where he talks about his loss to Conor Benn. He talks about how Conor Benn's body looked different that night than it had his prior fight. That Algieri was surprised by the transformation of Conor Benn's body. He also talks about the fact that there was no VADA testing for his fight, right? The purpose of this video is to help guys out. My view is that there's a culture of performance-enhancing drug usage. I don't talk about it, I'll be blunt, because I like my assets, because I don't want to be sued, because I have my own family to think about, and I recognize that some of these boxers have more financial resources than I do, right? I also realize that it's impossible, literally impossible, to fully weed out performance-enhancing drug usage in an undercapitalized sport like boxing. We only care about the big fights here on YouTube. When someone's fighting for an elimination match, to become a mandatory contender, to get a shot at the title, or a big title fight. But understand, the real sport is poor. The real sport has guys who are willing to get beaten up, willing to get hit in the head, willing to risk injury to make a living in places way off the grid, right? Farmhouses, states you've barely heard of, states with no professional football or baseball team, states where cronies, and I'm talking about the United States, states where cronies become the boxing commissioner and where people look the other way, where there isn't enough money to pay for drug testing. Right? Understand, the majority of fighters come from humble beginnings. So you have a lot of people in the sport, a lot, who aren't going to look into whether or not a fighter is on PEDs. Let me point out, too, that even the people who look into whether a fighter is on PEDs are sometimes way behind what's actually happening in the world where people use PEDs. So this Conor Benn positive test is striking because the British board did not bust Conor Benn. he passed their tests. In other words, the mandatory test, he passed. It's the private VADA tests that he failed. Had VADA not been involved with the fight, Conor Benn would have passed, right? Did pass, and the fight would have gone forward. So what I want to do is to make a few points here, right? Because I want to protect those who are brave enough to come forward and speak the truth, right? When it comes to PED use, I don't. I pull the punch. I don't want to get sued. The people speaking out, saying things like, yes, I believe this guy is juicing, right? This guy is, using substances. Those people are placing themselves at risk because let me tell you what's happened in the past. Juicers have a desire to not get caught. They have a regimen that involves them testing themselves before they actually get tested by the British board. Right? They have a team that will tell the public reasons why the fighter doesn't want to include a steroid clause in the agreement. Right? In the past, and I'm not accusing anyone particular of juicing, but in the past we've heard stories such as the fighter is afraid of needles. That's why the fighter didn't want to agree to performance-enhancing drug testing. Right? Let me also point out, too, that states want revenue. They want the fight to happen in their state. Venues actually compete to have big fights happen where they are. So you've had some states that I've long suspected have made it incredibly easy to beat a PED test. Right? There was an Emmanuel Stewart fighter, right, who was clean, who negotiated drug testing into his agreement. Right? Now, the fight took place in Texas. I'm just telling you that the drug testers down there allowed multiple guys to go in the bathroom with the fighter who was to provide the urine test. They came out of the bathroom with urine. The key question was, whose urine was it? The test was done post-fight. And of course, the urine came back clean. Right? I would argue that the state of Texas for years, in my opinion, and note the qualifier, in my opinion, was unreliable in terms of monitoring fighters. Let me just say, too, that the fighters who have power, in other words, people with belts, they will often dictate where the fight is going to be held. Right? The idea is, hey, you want my belt, you're going to fight where I want to fight. So they will pick places with big arenas, right? This is professional prize fighting. You want people to pay to see you fight, and you want a lot of such people to pay to see you fight. But they will shop forums. So they're fighting in a location that doesn't have stringent drug testing. Right, folks? That's the way the game is played. Let me also say, too, and I'm older, right? You can't assume that people who are older share your values. You just can't. I was alive during the 1990s. I've been a baseball fan since I was a toddler. Right? You knew when you saw second basemen and leadoff hitters hitting 30, 40 home runs, right? Looking like historical baseball figures, right? Ernie Banks type figures. You understood something was wrong. You knew when pitchers who had lost the edge on their fastballs were suddenly all having career years every year and seemed to have extra muscle. You knew something was wrong. I believe in the 1970s, only one guy got to 50 home runs. George Foster with the Reds one year. I believe in the 80s, only one guy got to 50 home runs. Cecil Fielder, if you remember him. You got to the 90s, and sometimes you had, let's just say, multiple guys over 50 home runs in the same division. And baseball had several divisions. Right? We all knew, folks, that folks were juicing. Right? As I said here before, in the famous Kirk Gibson baseball game in the World Series, 88 series, when Jose Canseco was at the plate, and I mention Jose because he's admitted to juicing, fans started yelling, "Steroids, steroids," in Los Angeles. Folks, it wasn't a secret. Right? Understand. Back in the day, we looked at athletes, track and field, some athletes dropping tenths of a second off world records in sprints. We looked at athletes and the understanding was, okay, well, let me enjoy the show. That was the era. Right? The officials pinched people. Ben Johnson got pinched in the 100 meters at the 88 Olympics. But there was a sizable crowd that thought, hey, we know they used to use greenies, amphetamines in baseball back in the day. We understand that people have cut corners in sports for years, right? Baseball, stealing signs is a culture. Right? You recently had a team that had a buzzer go off when certain things were happening in the dugout. So people knew the pitch that was coming. You have the 1951 Giants, who literally cut corners, right? Had an advanced system to steal signs, to know what pitches were coming and things like that. So what's the big difference here in terms of these newfangled PEDs and people using amphetamines in the past? I'm just telling you that was the thought process. Floyd Mayweather wanted a anti-PED clause put into a contract. No less than Marvin Hagler, right? Hall of Famer, great middleweight champion of several years, criticized Floyd. Not only didn't back Floyd, criticized Floyd. Said Floyd is using excuses not to sign the contract. He should sign the contract. Right? Fighters back in the day weren't focused on whether you were using PEDs or not. Well, now we understand. Now we realize that if you used the cream in the clear, you weren't trying to get to 61 home runs. No, you had a possibility of getting into the 70s. Right? Understand, I am a big Barry Bonds fan. Right? But I recognize the cream in the clear lifted his game. Right? I watched Sammy Sosa for years. Sammy, completely fluent in English. Completely fluent in English. He goes before Congress and suddenly he can barely speak English. Right? He can only speak Spanish. He's only comfortable speaking Spanish. Right? Sammy's English was so good that he was baseball broadcaster announcer level. You thought, oh, Sammy's one of these guys who could become a broadcaster after he finished. Until, of course, he showed up before Congress. Right? Mark McGwire, suddenly, after an illustrious past, where he got into the 60s, right? He got to 70 home runs in a season. Didn't want to talk about the past, only wanted to talk about the future. I believe now we understand, because sports are increasingly digitized, right? Now we understand the advantage that PEDs can give you. So let me issue a warning, and it's a serious warning, to people speaking out on PED use in boxing. Right? You can get sued. You need to think about the distinct possibility that the juicer has so much committed to his reputation, that the juicer has made such a big decision to cut corners in his career and has so much at stake, that the juicer could sue you and could keep the lawsuit going longer than you could stay solvent. And that the juicer is going to have people around him who are going to say, you've got to be kidding. This fighter's completely clean. By the way, we're seeing some of that in the Conor Benn situation. Right? Google the people who are saying, you've got to be kidding. We're crushed. We're surprised. We don't know how this test result could have come back the way it did. Right? You need to understand what's against you. Right? In baseball, they busted guys dead to right using the cream and the clear. And of course, the response that those guys had was, I used the cream and the clear, but I didn't know they were steroids. If you're a little bit older and you remember the East German women's Olympic team, right? Look up some of the records, folks. The women's 400-meter record, the world record, that still stands since 1985, right? Was run by an East German athlete, and when East Germany fell, understand, someone got the juicing tables. And we don't know if the juicing tables are accurate, but let's just say you have some world record holders and you have discussion of a regimen that was being followed. Even the tests they took before they left for the Olympics to make sure that they could pass the Olympic testing protocol. Right? No woman has come close to that 400-meter record since it was set in 1985. Right? No one's come close. Right? There are other records we could scrutinize. Just understand, record-setting performances are possible with juicing. So if you're sued by a juicer, if a juicer comes out and says, how dare you accuse me of cheating? It's an uphill battle. And the way it's going to end is with the sport continuing to have a culture of PED use. Why? Because sometimes it's the difference between poverty or life as an average Joe, right? You're the milkman, or you're working at the post office, and the life of a millionaire, multimillionaire, right? You're a former champion. You got some big purses. You live in a big mansion in a big part of town. Your kids go to elite schools. Your kids never have to worry about their next meal. Right? Understand that economic reality almost mandates that there will be PEDs in, you name it, boxing, baseball, pro football, right? All of these sports have had people pinched on PED use. So if you view yourself as a whistleblower, now Chris Algieri was careful in his interview with Chris Mannix, right? He said he was surprised by the transformation in Conor Benn's body, right? He couched it subjectively. Let me just say, if you view yourself as a whistleblower and you're going to make comments on somebody else's PED usage, you need to be aware of defamation laws, right? Libel, which is written defamation, or slander, which is oral defamation, right? I believe you have to protect yourself. Even online, when I'm riffing about things, I will say, I think that, right? I think that. Don't make a bold statement of fact, ever, that someone was using PEDs, unless you are prepared to say you personally witnessed them use PEDs. Rather, what you want to do is just stick to facts that are already in the public awareness. So for Conor Benn, I think it's a mistake to say Conor Benn used PEDs. I think that's a mistake. I think that opens the door for you getting sued, right? I filed defamation lawsuits on behalf of clients. I'm just telling you, it's a mistake. What you want to say instead is that VADA found some irregularities in Conor Benn's sample, right? You want to say that he failed the VADA test? Okay, fine. I know it's nuanced, but that's far less risky than saying he used PEDs, right? If you're sued, you can then get VADA. You can subpoena VADA and have them, state in discovery that, in fact, irregularities were found in Conor Benn's test sample, right? You can prove that. Conor Benn, of course, might argue that the test is inaccurate, right? But just understand, even if he's going to make that argument, you've already established the truth of what you're saying. If you're going to try to use an opinion defense, I would couch it as purely an opinion defense, right? So you could say something like, I think it's odd that Algieri Conor Benn fight didn't have VADA doing the testing, right? Couch it as a positive. Even when you're making a negative statement, you can say, I would feel a lot more comfortable personally had the fighters been tested by VADA. If you're a fighter, right, as I've said earlier, you need to consider steroids in your opponent as adding 10 to 20 pounds of extra muscle, right? That's what it does. So, in my opinion, right, if you think a guy is juicing, and if you go back and you look at their VADA history, and you find out that none of their fights had VADA testing, if you go back and you look at their amateur history, and you find out that the guy didn't have a lot of knockouts in the amateurs, if you go back and you look at old films of your opponent, and you notice that he has a different body back then, right? Now, we all understand people mature in their late teens and in their 20s, right? My voice might be deeper today than it was when I was 20. But all I'm saying is some of the body transformations, folks, are remarkable. Right? Remarkable. Guys have gone from looking like the chubby kid in high school to being sculpted in their 20s. Right? What fighters need to do, too, before they agree to fights is look at the jurisdictions that the opponent has fought in. Right? Now, earlier in this video, I expressed my opinion that I found Texas to be unreliable as a jurisdiction a few years ago. Right? I would question their commitment to reviewing drug test samples a few years ago. Right? Well, understand, if your opponent has only fought in jurisdictions like that, right, and hasn't fought in these jurisdictions with rigorous testing, then you should have doubts. Right? Young fighters trying to protect unbeaten records need to make a decision on how much risk they're going to take. Right? If you're fighting a guy who has no amateur pedigree, but yet he's knocking everyone out. He has next to no baby fat on him now, but yet he had a lot of fat a few years ago. If you look at his team, and if someone on that team has been part of a team for a fighter that you've also had suspicions about. Right? A fighter who may himself have failed drug tests. Then the red flags are out. Right? You almost need to fight an older fighter who has a track record, so you can see how much power the guy has. You can have an idea on whether the guy's body today looks enhanced versus where he was. Right? You want to fight an older fighter who has dealt with the California State Boxing Commission, the New York State Boxing Commission, and of course, you need to prioritize having VADA testing in the contract. Make this a contractual matter. You want to fight me, we need to have VADA testing. Right? As I pointed out in an earlier video too, young people on steroids can go all day. 3 minutes around, 12 rounds. Right? I'm just telling you the body eventually starts to rebel against steroid users. How do I know? Look at the bodybuilding community. Look at how many of those bodybuilders, as they got older, had to get off the stuff. Literally lost dozens of pounds of muscle. Folks, you can Google older bodybuilders. Here on YouTube, you're going to be astonished. I'm just telling you that by the time a juicer gets into their very late 20s, early 30s, their body starts to rebel against them. They have to take at least 2 rounds off in a 12 rounds fight. They can't be under stress the whole way. Right? You need to also view with suspicion some of the fight cancellations. Right? If you don't understand it, if it's not the kind of thing that can show up on an MRI, right? Torn bicep or something like that, then you need to be suspicious of the fight cancellation. Let me also say too, some of these torn biceps, that's a red flag as well, because the body has too much muscle mass. Let me tell you how widespread PED use is in boxing. There's a well-known fighter, I'm not going to out him. He had a fight years ago against an opponent. They were testing for the testosterone ratio. And of course, the opponent failed the post-fight drug test. Understand, the sanctioning body did nothing about it because the well-known fighter also had elevated testosterone levels. In other words, in a fight subject to testing, both guys failed the test. The story got dropped. You can Google boxing match. Both guys failed steroid tests. The name of the fighter might actually shock you. Right? And so, if you view yourself as a whistleblower, I need for you to think twice. And I mean this, because I've made videos on PEDs, and some of the people who subscribe to my channel have made some explosive statements in the comment section. They'll say, I know this guy's using steroids. I would rather you say, simply, if the person failed a drug test, this fighter failed this drug test before this fight. Right? Let's just keep it simple. Right? Don't go out on a limb. Just stick to verifiable facts. Right? Chris Algieri is very well schooled, right, in how to handle himself. So he throws out words like, I was surprised. Right? He knows not to say, Conor Ben juiced before our fight. Right? He knows not to say that. Instead, he conveys his surprise at seeing Conor Ben's body transformation in the 4 months between Ben's prior fight and Ben's fight against Chris Algieri. Right? Don't get sued. Let's be careful. But I need for people to understand the hard reality. Just like we don't know, and we don't, which East German women were juicing at the Olympics. We don't know that with any certainty. Right? There are world records still on the books. Right? Just like we can't tell with any certainty in that situation. We simply don't know with any certainty. With any certainty. Who is juicing in boxing? It'll always be hazy. Just understand the culture is so well defined that Jarrell Miller signed to fight for the heavyweight championship against Anthony Joshua. And according to tests, he was using multiple substances. Just understand, Conor Ben signed to fight in a BBOC fight Chris Eubank Jr. And we're hearing now that he did not pass the VADA test. And worse yet, what was in his system wasn't excessive coffee, right? Excessive caffeine, where you say, I was hitting the coffee shop a bit too much. Right? It wasn't the kind of thing that could get into your system accidentally. Rather, it was a female fertility substance. Right? Think about that. And also watch the people around Conor Ben. Right? They have come out and said, we are surprised. Right? Are we supposed to believe that Conor Ben on his own somehow came in contact with female fertility substances? Is that what they want us to believe? Right? So all I'm saying is be careful. Don't be the person sued for defamation by a juicer, and don't be the person in the other corner who's a young up-and-coming fighter looking across at someone, thinking they're a juicer, having that person be younger than you, right? Having the red flags all around. If you're a young, unbeaten fighter, pick your opponents carefully. Again, that's going to require you to investigate your opponent's background, his prior body type, whether he's been in fights where VADA has been agreed upon, as well as the jurisdictions in which he has fought. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.